My family thinks I don't know how to use the smart home camera. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. The first thing I remember from that Tuesday morning in October was the bitter taste of hospital coffee and the way my fingers trembled as I held the paper cup. The stroke had left me weak, confused, my left side barely responding to my commands. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I was about to witness through that tiny camera lens in my Brooklyn apartment. I was 73 years old, lying in that sterile room at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, surrounded by the constant hum of machines and the antiseptic smell that clung to everything. The wallpaper was that particular shade of mint green that hospitals seem to love, peeling at the corners like old skin. Outside my window, I could see the familiar skyline of my neighborhood, the brownstones where I'd lived for 47 years, where I'd raised my children, where I'd poured my heart and soul into building what I thought was a loving family. My phone sat silent on the bedside table. Not a single call, not one text message asking how I was doing, if I needed anything, if I was scared. And I was scared. Terrified, actually. The doctor had explained that another stroke could happen at any time. My memory came and went like waves on a beach, sometimes crystal clear, sometimes foggy and uncertain. But I wasn't completely helpless. You see, my son David had installed what he called a smart home system 6 months earlier. Security cameras, he said, for my protection. Motion sensors, door alarms, the works. He'd shown me the app once, spoke to me like I was a child, his voice slow and patronizing. "Mom, it's probably too complicated for you, but don't worry about it. We'll monitor everything from our phones." What David didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been a secretary for 30 years at a law firm in downtown Brooklyn. I knew my way around technology better than they gave me credit for. And during those long, lonely evenings after they'd all stopped calling, I'd figured out every button, every setting, every angle of those cameras. So there I was, Tuesday evening, October 15th, propped up in my hospital bed with my phone in my shaking hands, watching the live feed from my own living room. At first, I thought maybe the medication was making me hallucinate, because what I saw couldn't possibly be real. My living room was full of people. My children, Sarah, David, and Michael, along with their spouses and teenage kids. There were balloons. Black balloons, can you believe that? Black balloons tied to my favorite reading chair, the one I'd had reupholstered just last year with my Social Security money. There was a banner hanging from the mantel that read, "Rest in peace, Mom," in gold letters. They were having a party, my funeral party, while I was still alive. I watched Sarah, my only daughter, the one I'd sacrificed everything for, raising a glass of what looked like champagne. Her voice came through the tiny speaker on my phone, crackling but clear enough to understand every devastating word. "Finally," she said, her voice bright with relief. "We don't have to pretend anymore. No more guilt trips. No more playing nursemaid to someone who refuses to take care of herself." The room erupted in laughter. My grandchildren, kids I'd babysat countless times, whose diapers I'd changed, whose tears I'd dried, they were laughing too. 16-year-old Emma, who I'd taught to bake chocolate chip cookies just last Christmas, was taking selfies with the Rest in Peace banner. David, my practical son, the one who'd always been good with numbers, was already talking about selling the apartment. "The real estate market in Brooklyn is insane right now," he was saying, gesturing with a beer bottle. "We could easily get 800,000, maybe more. Split 3 ways, that's enough to really make a difference in our lives." I dropped the phone. It clattered against the metal rail of my hospital bed, the sound echoing in the empty room like a gunshot. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up again. When I did, the screen had gone dark, but the images were burned into my memory forever. Have you ever felt your heart break? I don't mean metaphorically. I mean actually felt it shatter inside your chest. Each piece cutting you from the inside out? That's what happened to me in that moment. The physical pain of the stroke was nothing compared to this. I spent the next hour crying. Not the gentle tears of sadness, but the raw, ugly sobbing of complete betrayal. A nurse came in around 9:30, a young woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who held my shoulders while I shook. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked. "Are you in pain? Should I call the doctor?" How could I explain? How could I tell her that my children, the 3 human beings I'd loved more than life itself, were celebrating my death while I was still breathing, that they were already planning how to spend the money from selling my home, the place where I'd changed their diapers, helped with homework, kissed scraped knees, and stayed up all night when they had fevers? "Just a nightmare," I whispered. "Just a bad dream." But it wasn't a dream. It was my reality. And lying there in that hospital bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to die quietly. I wasn't going to fade away and let them pick over my bones like vultures. Not anymore. Let me tell you how I got to this point. Because this didn't happen overnight. This was 47 years in the making. I came to Brooklyn in 1976, fresh from a small town upstate, with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of hope. I was 26 years old, newly married to Robert, and pregnant with our first child. We scraped together enough money for a tiny 1-bedroom apartment on 4th Avenue, the kind of place where the pipes banged all night and the heat barely worked in winter. But it was ours, and I was happy. Sarah was born that December, during one of the worst blizzards New York had seen in decades. The hospitals were overwhelmed, and I labored for 18 hours before she finally arrived, red-faced and screaming, the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. 2 years later came David, quiet and serious even as a baby. Michael followed when I was 31, my surprise baby who turned our small apartment into chaos and filled it with more love than I'd thought possible. Robert worked construction then, when he could find work. The economy was rough in the late 70s, and there were weeks when he'd come home covered in dust and disappointment, having spent the day looking for jobs that didn't exist. So I did what needed to be done. I put my dreams of college on hold, permanently, as it turned out, and found work as a secretary at Morrison, Klein & Associates, a small law firm in Brooklyn Heights. Every morning, I'd take the subway into the city, my heels clicking on the platform as I rushed to catch the 8:15 train. I learned to type 90 words per minute, to file legal documents, to answer phones with a smile even when my feet ached from standing all day. The lawyers treated me well enough, but I was invisible to them, just another middle-aged woman keeping their world running smoothly. I remember the day Mr. Morrison taught me to use the computer system. This was 1987, and personal computers were still relatively new. "Mrs. Chen," he said. He never could pronounce my maiden name correctly, even after I'd corrected him dozens of times. "You seem pretty sharp with this technology stuff. Think you can handle the new filing system?" I could. I did. I became the unofficial IT person for the office, fixing problems, learning software, keeping up with every technological change that came our way. It was the first time in years that someone had asked me to use my brain for something other than remembering grocery lists and doctor's appointments. But at home, I was just Mom, the woman who made breakfast every morning, packed lunches, helped with homework, did laundry, cleaned house, grocery shopped, cooked dinner, and collapsed into bed exhausted every single night. Robert tried to help, though his definition of help usually involved watching the kids while I ran errands. He was a good man, don't get me wrong, but he was a product of his generation. The house and children were my responsibility. The money from my job went directly into the family fund. School clothes, soccer cleats, music lessons, birthday parties, everything the kids needed came first. My own needs rarely made the list. I wore the same 3 blouses to work for 5 years, rotating them carefully and mending them when they wore thin. My shoes had holes in the soles that I covered with cardboard and electrical tape. Sarah wanted to take dance lessons when she was 8. Ballet, she said, twirling around the living room in her little pink tutu from Woolworths. The classes cost $60 a month, which might as well have been $6,000 on our budget. I took on extra typing work in the evenings, staying up until midnight, transcribing legal documents by lamplight while the rest of the family slept. 4 months later, I had enough saved for her lessons. She danced for 6 months before deciding she was bored with ballet. She wanted to try gymnastics instead, then piano, then art classes. Each time, I found a way to make it work. I sold my grandmother's wedding ring that I'd planned to give to Sarah someday. I took a second job cleaning offices on weekends. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day for 2 years to save on grocery money. David was different. He was practical, even as a child, more interested in how things worked than in games or sports. He'd take apart radios and clocks, spreading the pieces across the kitchen table while I cooked dinner. "Look, Mom," he'd say, his small fingers covered in grease. "I can fix this." And he usually could. I was so proud of him, my little engineer, my problem solver. When he was 12, David announced he wanted to build a computer. This was 1989, when computers cost thousands of dollars and seemed like magic to most people. But David had been reading magazines, studying catalogs, and he had a plan. He needed $200 for parts. $200 that we absolutely didn't have. I looked at that earnest little face, those bright eyes full of hope and determination, and I couldn't say no. I applied for a credit card, my first and only one, and charged the computer parts. David spent the entire summer building that computer, and when school started, he was the only kid in his class who could program in BASIC. The credit card took me 3 years to pay off. 3 years of making minimum payments while the interest charges piled up like snow. But seeing David's excitement when that computer finally booted up for the first time, it was worth every penny. Michael was my baby, my wild child, the one who kept me young and constantly worried. He played every sport available, which meant equipment, uniforms, tournament fees, and gas money for all those weekend trips to games in New Jersey and Long Island. He broke his arm twice, his nose once, and went through more sneakers than seemed physically possible. When Michael was 15, he decided he wanted to play hockey. Not just any hockey, competitive travel hockey, the kind where parents mortgage their houses to pay for equipment and coaching. The startup costs alone were over $3,000. Robert and I had the biggest fight of our marriage that night, voices raised loud enough to wake the neighbors. "We can't afford this, Linda," Robert said, his face red with frustration. "We're already stretched thin. The kids need to learn that money doesn't grow on trees." "He's good at this," I countered, remembering how Michael's face lit up when he talked about hockey, how he'd practiced with a tennis ball and a broom handle in our tiny living room. This could be his future, a college scholarship maybe. We have to try. I took a loan against my retirement account. It wasn't much. I'd only been contributing $20 a month for 15 years, but it was enough to get Michael started. He played hockey for 3 years, and while the scholarship never materialized, those were the happiest years of his teenage life. How do you put a price on your child's happiness? College was a nightmare of financial juggling that I still don't fully understand how we survived. Sarah wanted to study education at Brooklyn College, which seemed reasonable until we discovered all the additional costs: books, supplies, student fees, parking permits. David was accepted to engineering school at Polytechnic, a prestigious and expensive program that would give him the future he dreamed of. Michael followed 2 years later with plans to study business. I worked overtime every week for 6 years. Evenings, weekends, holidays. Anytime the law firm needed extra help, I was there. My social life disappeared completely. Friends stopped calling because I never had time to meet for coffee or see movies. Robert and I barely spoke except to coordinate schedules and discuss which bills to pay first. The stress started affecting my health. I developed high blood pressure, chronic headaches, and an ulcer that landed me in the emergency room twice. But I kept working, kept pushing, because my children's futures depended on it. When Sarah graduated with her teaching degree, when David got his engineering certification, when Michael walked across the stage with his business diploma, those moments made all the sleepless nights worth it. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong came at Sarah's wedding in 2003. She'd been dating Tom for 3 years, a nice accountant from Bay Ridge who treated her well and made her laugh. I was so happy for her, so proud to see my little girl in her white dress, radiant and beautiful. I'd saved money for 2 years to help pay for the wedding, tucking away $20 and $30 at a time from my grocery budget. It wasn't enough for everything Sarah wanted. She had dreams of a reception at the Grand Prospect Hall, a dress from a boutique in Manhattan, but I managed to contribute $4,000 toward the celebration. The morning of the wedding, I was in Sarah's room at the hotel, helping her with her veil, when she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Mom," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." My heart skipped a beat. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" "Did you take money from the wedding fund? Tom and I are short about $1,500 for the final payment to the caterer." I stared at her, confused. "What?" "No, honey. I gave you everything I had saved. $4,000. "I know, but we counted everything last night and we're still short. Dad said maybe you used some of it for something else and forgot to tell us." She was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. "This is my wedding day, Mom. How could you do this to me?" It turned out that Robert had borrowed the money 3 weeks earlier to fix his truck without telling anyone. He'd planned to replace it before the wedding, but the repair job he was counting on fell through. Instead of taking responsibility, he'd let Sarah believe I was to blame. I found out later that evening, after the reception, after my daughter had spent the most important day of her life thinking I'd betrayed her. I forgave Robert because I'd been forgiving him for 27 years by then. It was easier than fighting, and I forgave Sarah because she was my daughter, and she'd been under tremendous stress. But something changed between us that day. A crack opened in our relationship that never quite healed. The pattern repeated itself over the next few years. David needed money for a down payment on his first house. The bank required 20% down, which was more than he'd saved. "Just a loan, Mom," he assured me. "I'll pay you back with interest. It's actually a good investment for you." I cashed in the remainder of my retirement account and lent him $18,000. David moved into his new house in Park Slope, and I moved into a studio apartment in Sunset Park because I could no longer afford the rent on the 4th Avenue place where I'd raised my children. The repayment plan lasted exactly 4 months before David decided he needed to renovate the kitchen. "The house will be worth so much more with an updated kitchen, Mom. Can we adjust the payment schedule just temporarily?" Temporarily turned into indefinitely. David never did pay me back, although he did invite me to his housewarming party, where he showed off his granite countertops and stainless steel appliances to friends who nodded appreciatively and mentioned how lucky he was to be able to afford such a beautiful renovation. Michael's crisis came 2 years later. His business, a consulting firm he'd started with a college friend, was struggling. They'd landed a big contract, but the client wanted 90 days to pay, and Michael needed money to cover expenses in the meantime. "It's just cash flow, Mom. The money's guaranteed, but I need $15,000 to bridge the gap." I didn't have $15,000. I barely had $1,500, but Michael was desperate, and he was my baby, the boy who'd hugged me tight every morning before school, who'd called me from college just to hear my voice. So I did what I'd always done. I found a way. I took out a reverse mortgage on the little studio apartment I owned. It was risky, the bank counselor explained, because it meant I'd never truly own my home again. But Michael's business was going to succeed. He was so confident, so convincing, and he'd pay off the mortgage within 5 years. Guaranteed. Michael's business failed 6 months later. The big client never paid, and his partner disappeared with what little money remained in their accounts. Michael moved back home with me for a while, sleeping on my pull-out couch and eating my food while he figured out his next move. That next move turned out to be blaming me for his problems. If I hadn't let him play all those expensive sports as a kid, he said, maybe he would have been more focused on academics. If I'd pushed him harder in school, maybe he would have been better prepared for the business world. If I'd been more supportive instead of always worrying about money, maybe he would have had the confidence to make his company succeed. He moved out after 3 months, owing me money for groceries, utilities, and the emotional toll of listening to him rewrite our family history to make me the villain in his story. Robert died in 2010, suddenly, of a heart attack at the construction site where he was working. He was 63 years old, still working full-time because we couldn't afford for him to retire. I found out later that he'd been having chest pains for weeks, but hadn't told anyone because he was afraid of the cost of medical tests. The funeral was small but dignified. I used the little bit of life insurance money to give Robert a proper send-off, with flowers and a reception at the local community center. My children came, of course, dressed in black and playing the part of grieving family members. But during the reception, I overheard Sarah talking to her Aunt Maureen. "It's probably for the best," Sarah was saying, her voice low but not quiet enough. "Dad hadn't been happy in years. And now Mom won't have to take care of him when he gets old and sick. She can focus on herself for once. Focus on myself." As if I'd ever had that luxury. As if the 43 years of marriage had been a burden I was now free to cast off. The years after Robert's death were the loneliest of my life. I was 68 years old, living alone in my tiny apartment, working part-time at the law firm because full retirement wasn't financially possible. My children had their own lives, their own problems, their own families to worry about. I understood that. Truly I did. But I'd call them sometimes, just to hear their voices, and the conversations always felt rushed, distracted. "How are you doing, Mom?" Sarah would ask. But I could hear her kids fighting in the background, could sense her impatience to get back to her real life. "I'm fine," I'd always say, because that's what good mothers do. We don't burden our children with our problems. But I wasn't fine. I was fading away, becoming more invisible every day. Cashiers at the grocery store looked through me. Neighbors nodded politely, but never stopped to chat. I felt like I was disappearing, one piece at a time, and no one would notice when I was finally gone. The loneliness was crushing. I'd sit in my apartment for days without hearing my own voice except to say thank you to delivery drivers. I started talking to myself just to break the silence, commenting on TV shows or reading newspaper articles aloud. Sometimes I'd call the wrong number on purpose, just to have a conversation with a stranger who might speak to me like I was a real person. My health started declining more noticeably in my early 70s. Arthritis made it hard to open jars or climb stairs. My memory would slip sometimes. I'd forget names or lose track of conversations mid-sentence. High blood pressure medication made me dizzy. Diabetes required constant monitoring and dietary restrictions that made meals feel more like medical procedures than nourishment. David noticed first. He started calling more frequently, asking pointed questions about my health, my living situation, my ability to take care of myself. At first, I was touched by his concern. My practical son was looking out for me, making sure I was okay. "Mom, have you thought about what you'd do in an emergency?" he asked one Sunday afternoon. "What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone?" I hadn't thought about it, actually. The possibility of lying helpless on my apartment floor, waiting for someone to find me, was terrifying. David had a solution, of course. He always did. "There's this new technology called smart home systems," he explained. "Cameras, sensors, alert buttons. If something happens, it automatically contacts emergency services. And the best part is, We can monitor everything from our phones, so we'll know you're safe." It sounded wonderful. For the first time in months, I felt like my children were thinking about me, caring about my well-being. David came over the following weekend with boxes of equipment and a young man who spent 3 hours installing cameras in every room, motion sensors by the doors, and a medical alert pendant that I could wear around my neck. "See, Mom?" David said, showing me the app on his phone where he could view live feeds from all the cameras. "Now we'll never have to worry about you. And if you ever need help, just press the button on your pendant." He tried to show me how to use the app myself, but his explanations were rushed and condescending. "It's probably too complicated for you to understand," he said, the same tone he'd use with a child or someone with dementia. "Don't worry about it. We'll handle all the technical stuff." Sarah and Michael had the app too, David explained. All 3 of my children could check on me anytime they wanted. I felt safer than I had in years. What I didn't realize was that I'd just given them front row seats to watch me disappear. The stroke happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I was making coffee when the room started spinning, and suddenly I couldn't feel the left side of my body. The smart home system worked exactly as advertised. An ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, and I was rushed to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. But none of my children came to the hospital that first day, or the second. Sarah called once to ask if I needed anything, but when I said I was scared and lonely, she reminded me that she had her own family to worry about. David sent a text message asking if the doctors had given me a prognosis. Michael didn't contact me at all. By the 4th day, I was desperate for human connection. The nurses were kind but busy. My roommate was a woman with dementia who called me by her sister's name and asked me to help her find her purse every few minutes. The hours crawled by with nothing but my own thoughts and the constant hum of medical equipment. That's when I remembered the cameras. I'd been thinking about my apartment, wondering if my plants were getting enough water, if I'd left any windows open. The smart home app was still on my phone, and during a particularly lonely evening, I decided to check on things at home. The living room camera showed everything exactly as I'd left it. My reading chair, the side table with my half-finished crossword puzzle, the framed photos of my family from better times. It was comforting to see my little space, even from a hospital bed miles away. But then I started noticing things. People moving around in my apartment when no one should have been there. At first, I thought someone was robbing me. But the figures on the grainy camera feed looked familiar. It was Sarah, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her for emergencies. She was walking through my rooms, opening drawers, looking through my closets. David joined her later, carrying a notepad and what looked like a tape measure. They were cataloging my belongings, measuring my furniture, evaluating my possessions. I watched them for an hour, my heart sinking deeper with each minute. They weren't checking on my welfare or watering my plants. They were sizing up their inheritance. "The furniture's not worth much," I heard David say through the tiny speaker on my phone. "But the location is good. We should be able to get top dollar for the apartment itself." "What about all her papers?" Sarah asked, rifling through my desk. "Insurance policies, bank statements, that stuff?" "I'll handle the legal side," David replied. "Michael can deal with disposing of all the personal items. Most of it's probably just junk anyway." They talked about me like I was already dead, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person they'd once loved. I wanted to call them, to scream that I was still alive, still their mother, still deserving of their respect. But I was too shocked to move, too hurt to think clearly. That's when Michael arrived with beer and Chinese takeout, as if dividing up my life was a casual evening activity. The 3 of them sat in my living room, eating lo mein from containers while planning my estate. "Has anyone actually talked to the doctors?" Michael asked between bites. "Like, what are we looking at timeline-wise?" "I called this morning," Sarah said. "They're keeping her for observation but strokes at her age. It's not good. Even if she recovers from this one, there'll probably be others." "So we need to start getting things organized now," David concluded. power of attorney, healthcare proxy, all that stuff. And maybe we should think about assisted living options. She can't live alone anymore. That's obvious. They weren't discussing these decisions with me. They weren't considering what I might want or how I might feel about losing my independence. I was simply an elderly problem to be managed until I had the courtesy to die and stop being their responsibility. But the absolute worst was yet to come. The next evening, I watched through the camera feed as my apartment filled with people. Not just my 3 children, but their spouses, their kids, even some neighbors I recognized from the hallway. Someone had brought balloons, those horrible black balloons I'd seen earlier. Someone else had made a banner. Sarah stood up in the middle of my living room, raising a glass of champagne while everyone gathered around her. "I know this might seem morbid," she began, "but Mom always said she wanted us to celebrate her life instead of mourning her death. So that's what we're doing." The lies came pouring out, one after another. How much they'd loved me. How grateful they were for all my sacrifices. How they'd treasure my memory forever. It was a beautiful eulogy for a woman who wasn't dead yet, delivered by children who'd spent years taking advantage of my love and generosity. "Mom would be so happy to see us all together like this," Michael said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "She always said family was the most important thing." Family. The word tasted bitter even thinking about it. How could they use that word while dividing up my possessions and toasting to my death? David had brought a photo album, and they spent the next hour looking through old pictures and sharing memories. But the memories were sanitized, idealized versions of our family history. There was no mention of the money I'd lent and never been repaid. No acknowledgement of the years I'd worked multiple jobs to pay for their dreams. No recognition of the sacrifices I'd made or the dignity I'd lost in the process. They'd turned me into a saint in their stories, which somehow made the betrayal even worse. Saints don't need consideration or respect. Saints exist only to serve others and ask for nothing in return. Saints don't get angry when they're taken advantage of or hurt when they're ignored. I watched them laugh and cry and hug each other while sitting in my furniture, surrounded by my belongings, planning my future without my consent. And somewhere around midnight, when the last guest had left and my children were cleaning up the debris of their premature celebration, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be their saint anymore. I wasn't going to die quietly and conveniently. I was going to fight back. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. Not someone from my old firm. This needed to be completely confidential. I found a legal aid attorney in Manhattan who specialized in elder law, a sharp woman in her 50s named Janet Morrison, who listened to my story without judgment and took immediate action. "Mrs. Patterson," she said after our first consultation, "what your family is doing constitutes financial elder abuse. We can put a stop to this right now." Janet helped me change all my passwords, set up new bank accounts, and revoke the power of attorney documents I'd signed years earlier. More importantly, she helped me understand that I had rights. The right to control my own money, to make my own healthcare decisions, and to live my life on my own terms. The next step was ending my family's access to my apartment. I had the locks changed while I was still in the hospital, using a locksmith service that Janet recommended. The new keys went to me and a trusted neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez from 4B, who'd always been kind to me and had no connection to my children. When I was discharged from the hospital 5 days later, I came home to an apartment that felt different. Not just because of the new locks, but because it was truly mine again. No one could walk in whenever they pleased and rifle through my belongings. No one could catalog my possessions or measure my furniture without my permission. The cameras stayed, but I changed all the passwords and learned how to use the system myself. It wasn't that complicated once I took the time to figure it out. Within a week, I was monitoring my own apartment, controlling my own security, and feeling more empowered than I had in years. My children didn't realize anything had changed until David tried to use his key the following weekend. I watched through the camera feed as he stood in the hallway, confused and frustrated, trying key after key that no longer worked. He called my cell phone immediately. "Mom, what's wrong with the door? None of our keys work." "I changed the locks," I said simply. "What? Why would you do that?" There was so much I could have said. I could have told him about the funeral party, about watching them divide up my possessions, about the years of financial exploitation disguised as family love. Instead, I chose something simpler. "Because it's my home, David, and I decided I want more privacy." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly a minute. "Mom, are you feeling okay? This doesn't sound like you." "I'm feeling better than I have in years, actually." That was the truth. Despite the lingering effects of the stroke, the occasional dizzy spell, the weakness in my left arm, I felt stronger than I had in decades. Not physically, but emotionally. For the first time since Robert's death, I was making decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what others expected of me. David came back the next day with Sarah and Michael. I watched them through the camera as they stood in the hallway, having an increasingly heated discussion about what to do. Finally, Sarah pressed the doorbell. "Mom, we need to talk," she said when I answered the intercom. "We're worried about you." "Why are you worried?" I asked. "Because you're acting strange, changing locks, being secretive. It's not like you." She was right. It wasn't like me. The old me would have apologized for inconveniencing them and immediately made new keys. The old me would have invited them up for coffee and listened to their concerns with patience and understanding. The old me would have put their comfort ahead of my own dignity. But I wasn't the old me anymore. "I'm not being secretive," I said. "I'm being selective. If you'd like to visit, you can call and make an appointment like any other guest." The word guest hung in the air like a challenge. For their entire adult lives, my children had treated my home as their personal property, coming and going as they pleased, taking what they needed without asking. Now I was establishing boundaries, and they didn't like it one bit. "Mom, open this door right now," Michael demanded, his voice sharp with the tone he might use with his own children. "We need to talk about your behavior." "No," I said, and hung up the intercom. It was the first time I'd ever said no to one of my children without immediately following it with an explanation or apology. The first time I'd put my own needs ahead of their demands. And it felt absolutely terrifying and completely liberating at the same time. They stood in the hallway for another 10 minutes, alternating between pleading and demanding. I watched them through the security monitor, 3 middle-aged adults having a tantrum because their 73-year-old mother had finally grown a backbone. Eventually they left, but not before David called through the door one final time. "Mom, we're going to get you help whether you want it or not. This behavior isn't normal." Help. As if standing up for myself was a symptom of mental illness. As if demanding respect in my own home was evidence of dementia. The phone calls started immediately. Sarah called every day for a week, her voice switching between concern and frustration. "Mom, I talked to your doctor. He says stroke patients sometimes have personality changes. Maybe you should see a psychiatrist." David took a more direct approach. "Mom, I'm coming over Saturday morning. We need to go through your finances and make sure you're not making any bad decisions." Michael just left angry voicemails. "This is ridiculous, Mom. We're your children. We're supposed to take care of you, but you won't let us. How are we supposed to help if you won't even talk to us?" Each call reinforced my decision to pull away. They weren't concerned about my well-being. They were angry that I'd disrupted their plans for managing my life and assets. Not one of them asked how I was feeling emotionally or whether I was struggling with loneliness. They were focused entirely on regaining control. The isolation was difficult at first. For weeks, my phone rarely rang except for medical appointments and telemarketer calls. The silence that had felt oppressive before now felt peaceful. I could eat dinner without criticism, watch television without commentary, and go to bed without worrying about disappointing someone. I started rediscovering who I was beneath 47 years of motherhood and wifehood. I liked jazz music, which Robert had always dismissed as noise. I enjoyed reading mystery novels, which Sarah had called mindless entertainment. I preferred tea to coffee, cats to dogs, and staying up late to watch old movies on television. Mrs. Rodriguez invited me for dinner one evening, and I accepted. Her apartment was warm and filled with the smell of sofrito and the sound of salsa music. We talked for hours about our families, our histories, our dreams for retirement. She'd raised 4 children as a single mother after her husband left, and she understood the complexity of loving children who didn't always love you back. "Mia," she said, using the Spanish endearment that my own children had never used. "Sometimes we love so hard that we forget to save any love for ourselves." That night, I looked in the mirror for the first time in months. Really looked, not just checking for lipstick or combed hair. The woman staring back at me was older than I felt, more wrinkled than I remembered, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Determination, self-respect, the faint glimmer of hope. 3 months passed before the real confrontation came. I was getting stronger physically, doing the exercises the hospital physical therapist had taught me, eating better, sleeping through the night. My blood pressure had stabilized, and my doctor had reduced my medication. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I was living rather than just surviving. That's when Sarah showed up with official-looking papers and a man in an expensive suit. I watched them approach through the security camera and didn't answer when they rang the bell. Instead, I called Mrs. Rodriguez and asked her to come over as a witness to whatever was about to happen. "Mrs. Patterson," the man called through the intercom, "I'm attorney James Walsh. Your daughter Sarah has some concerns about your mental competence, and I need to speak with you about legal guardianship proceedings." Guardianship. The word hit me like a physical blow. My daughter was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could control my life and finances. After everything I'd done for her, every sacrifice I'd made, every dream of hers I'd funded with my own retirement money, this was her solution to my newfound independence. Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed my hand as I pressed the intercom button. "Mr. Walsh, I have legal representation of my own. Any communication needs to go through my attorney, Janet Morrison. I'll give you her contact information." "Ma'am, we just need to ask you a few questions. It's a simple competency evaluation." And I said no. "Please leave my property." But they didn't leave. Sarah used her old key, the one that no longer worked, to try to get into the building, then spent 20 minutes arguing with other tenants to let her into the lobby. I could hear her voice echoing in the stairwell, high-pitched with frustration. "She's my mother. She's sick. Someone needs to help me get through to her." The other tenants knew me well enough to know I wasn't sick or incompetent. Mrs. Martinez from 2A had been watching me improve steadily over the past few months. Mr. Johnson from 3C had helped me carry groceries and knew I was sharper than most people half my age. They weren't going to help Sarah bypass my clearly stated wishes. Finally, Sarah and her lawyer left, but not before she shouted through my door one last time. "Mom, you can't keep this up forever. We know about the money you've been hiding, and we're going to get it back." Money I'd been hiding. As if the small savings account I'd opened to protect my Social Security checks was some kind of criminal enterprise. As if wanting to control my own finances was evidence of mental instability. That evening, I called Janet Morrison and told her everything that had happened. She wasn't surprised. Elder financial abuse often escalates when the elderly person starts asserting their rights, she explained. Your children are probably panicking because they've realized they can't access your money anymore. Janet filed a restraining order the next day, legally requiring my children to stay away from my apartment building and to cease all harassment. The process was emotionally exhausting. I had to relive years of financial exploitation and document every instance of manipulation and control. But it was also empowering. For the first time in my adult life, I had legal protection against the people who were supposed to love me most. The restraining order changed everything. My children couldn't call me constantly, couldn't show up at my door unannounced, couldn't send lawyers or other intermediaries to pressure me. The silence was absolute, and at first, it was devastating. Despite everything they'd done, they were still my children. I'd carried each of them in my body, nursed them through illnesses, celebrated their achievements, worried about their futures. Cutting them out of my life felt like amputating part of myself. But as weeks turned into months, the space they'd vacated began filling with other things. I started volunteering at the local senior center, helping other elderly people navigate technology and legal issues. I joined a book club at the library and discovered I had opinions about literature that had nothing to do with what others expected me to think. I even started dating. George was a widower from my building, a retired plumber with gentle hands and a kind smile. We had coffee together every Tuesday morning and took walks along the promenade on sunny afternoons. He listened when I talked and never made me feel like my thoughts or feelings were inconvenient. "You know," George said one afternoon as we sat on a bench overlooking the harbor, "you're nothing like what I expected when we first met." "What did you expect?" "A sad old lady living in the past, I guess. Someone broken down by life. But you're not broken at all. You're just getting started." He was right. At 74 years old, I was finally getting started. The legal battles continued for almost a year. My children hired expensive lawyers and filed multiple petitions to have me declared incompetent. They claimed I had dementia, that I was being manipulated by predatory caretakers, that I was a danger to myself and others. Each court appearance was an ordeal of humiliation and frustration. Sitting in those sterile rooms while strangers discussed my mental capacity, listening to my own children describe me as confused and paranoid. It took every ounce of strength I had not to break down completely. But Janet was brilliant. She'd prepared meticulously, documenting my cognitive abilities, my financial management skills, my social connections. She brought witnesses who could testify to my competence: Mrs. Rodriguez, George, the volunteers at the senior center, even my former supervisor from the law firm. The judge's final ruling was comprehensive and decisive. Not only was I mentally competent to manage my own affairs, but the court found evidence of systematic financial exploitation by my adult children over many years. The restraining order was made permanent, and my children were ordered to pay restitution for the money they'd taken. I didn't expect them to actually pay, and they didn't. But the legal victory was about more than money. It was about recognition that what had happened to me was wrong, that I deserved better, that my rights as a human being had value. The day the court decision became final, I did something I'd dreamed of for months. I bought a plane ticket to California, somewhere I'd always wanted to visit but had never been able to afford. For the first time in my adult life, I was spending money on something purely for my own enjoyment. The trip was magical. I saw the Golden Gate Bridge, walked along the beach in Santa Monica, visited art museums, and ate at restaurants that served food I'd never tried before. I talked to strangers, made new friends, and discovered that the world was full of people who valued kindness and dignity. Qualities I'd always had but had forgotten were special. In San Francisco, I met another elderly woman at a coffee shop near Golden Gate Park. We started talking about traveling alone as seniors, and she shared her own story of late-life liberation after an abusive marriage. "The thing that surprises people," she told me, "is how much energy we have once we stop giving it all away to people who don't appreciate it." "You look like someone who just figured that out." She was right. I had figured it out, and the energy was incredible. I returned to Brooklyn with a new perspective on everything. My apartment felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. My routines felt chosen rather than imposed. My relationships, with Mrs. Rodriguez, with George, with the friends I'd made at the senior center, were based on mutual respect and genuine affection. But the biggest change was in how I saw myself. For decades, I'd defined my worth through my usefulness to others. I was a good mother because I sacrificed everything for my children. I was a good wife because I supported Robert's needs ahead of my own. I was a good woman because I never complained, never demanded, never put myself first. Now I understood that those definitions had been wrong. Goodness didn't require self-erasure. Love didn't demand financial exploitation. Family didn't mean accepting abuse without protest. The new me had boundaries. I said no when people made unreasonable requests. I charged fair prices when neighbors asked me to help with their computers or taxes. I spent money on things I enjoyed without guilt. I valued my own time and energy as much as I valued others. And people respected me more, not less. The volunteers at the senior center sought out my advice. The teenagers in my building asked me to teach them about technology. George introduced me to his friends as the smartest woman I know. Mrs. Rodriguez included me in her family gatherings because she wanted my company, not because she needed my services. The transformation wasn't just internal. I changed my appearance too. Got a stylish haircut, bought clothes that flattered my figure instead of hiding it, learned to wear makeup that enhanced my features. I wasn't trying to look young. I was trying to look like myself, the woman I'd been before decades of self-sacrifice had worn her away. The woman in the mirror now looked back at me with confidence. Her eyes were bright with curiosity about what came next, rather than dulled by regret about what had been lost. Her posture was straight, her expression alert, her whole presence commanding respect. 6 months after the court victory, something unexpected happened. My youngest grandchild, Emma, Sarah's daughter, sent me a letter. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered through the regular mail. "Dear Grandma," it began, "I know I'm not supposed to contact you, but I'm 18 now and can make my own decisions. I want you to know that I remember all the things you did for me when I was little. The cookies, the bedtime stories, the way you always listened when I had problems at school. I don't understand why my parents are so angry with you, but I know you're not the villain they've made you out to be. I love you, and I miss you. If you're willing, I'd like to see you sometime." I cried when I read that letter. The tears were partly sadness for all the years Emma and I had been kept apart, but mostly they were tears of joy. Someone from my family remembered who I really was. Someone valued our relationship for its own sake, not for what they could get from it. Emma and I met for lunch at a quiet restaurant in Park Slope. She was beautiful, tall and confident, with her grandfather's eyes and my stubborn chin. She was studying nursing at Brooklyn College, paying her own way with a combination of scholarships, student loans, and part-time work. "I never asked Mom and Dad for money," she told me over sandwiches and soup. "I saw how they treated you when you couldn't keep giving them everything they wanted. I decided I'd rather struggle than become like them." We talked for 3 hours. Emma filled me in on family news, told me about her studies and her boyfriend and her dreams of working with elderly patients. I shared stories about my own nursing ambitions, the ones I'd set aside when I got pregnant with Sarah. "You could still do that, you know," Emma said. "There are volunteer programs at hospitals, nursing homes, places that would love to have someone with your experience and compassion." She was right. Age didn't have to mean the end of useful contribution. It could mean the beginning of contribution on my own terms. That conversation with Emma marked the beginning of my new career. I started volunteering at the same hospital where I'd been treated for my stroke, helping other elderly patients navigate the medical system and advocate for their own care. The work was emotionally demanding, but incredibly rewarding. I met people who'd been abandoned by their families, people who'd never learned to stand up for themselves, people who'd accepted abuse because they didn't know they had other options. I shared my story with them, not the sanitized version my children preferred, but the real story of exploitation and liberation. Many of them started making changes in their own lives. They set boundaries with abusive adult children. They took control of their finances. They stopped accepting treatment that diminished their dignity. Some of them thanked me for giving them permission to value themselves. You showed me I'm not crazy for feeling angry. One woman told me after she'd successfully stopped her son from stealing her Social Security checks. You showed me I deserve better. That's when I realized my experience had a larger purpose. All those years of suffering, all those moments of humiliation and betrayal, they'd prepared me to help other people avoid the same traps. My pain had meaning if it could prevent someone else's. I started speaking at senior centers and community groups about elder financial abuse. I shared practical advice about protecting assets and legal rights. But I also talked about the emotional component. How to recognize manipulation. How to maintain self-worth in the face of family pressure. How to build new relationships based on mutual respect. The response was overwhelming. Every time I spoke, someone would approach me afterward with their own story of family exploitation. Adult children who demanded money regularly, but never visited unless they needed something. Relatives who promised care in exchange for inheritance, and then provided neither. Family members who used emotional manipulation to maintain control over elderly parents' lives and resources. "I thought it was just me," was the phrase I heard most often. I thought I was the only one whose children treated them this way. They weren't alone. Elder abuse by family members is far more common than most people realize, and it often goes unreported because victims are ashamed or afraid of losing the little family connection they have left. But speaking about it openly, sharing our stories, creates space for healing and change. My new purpose gave me energy I hadn't felt in decades. I woke up excited about the day ahead, eager to connect with people who might benefit from my experience. I went to bed satisfied that I'd used my time meaningfully, that my presence in the world had value beyond what I could provide for others. The work also brought unexpected bonuses. I met other volunteers who became genuine friends, people who invited me to social events because they enjoyed my company. I developed skills I'd never known I had: public speaking, event planning, conflict resolution. I discovered leadership abilities that had been buried under decades of deference to others' wishes. George started attending my speaking events, sitting in the back row and beaming with pride as I shared my story. Afterward, he'd tell anyone who'd listen about my brilliant girlfriend who's changing the world one senior citizen at a time. Mrs. Rodriguez became my unofficial publicity manager, spreading word about my presentations throughout our neighborhood. "Linda has something important to say," she'd tell people. "You should come listen to her wisdom." Even my doctor noticed the change. "Whatever you're doing," he said during a routine checkup, "keep doing it. Your blood pressure is excellent, your cognitive function is sharp, and you have more energy than patients half your age." What I was doing was living authentically for the first time in my adult life. I was using my abilities for purposes I'd chosen, building relationships based on mutual benefit, and contributing to causes I cared about. I was being valued for qualities I'd always possessed, but had never been encouraged to develop. 2 years after the court victory, I did something that would have been unthinkable during my previous life. I bought a house. Not a big house, and not in an expensive neighborhood, but a little 2-bedroom bungalow in Bay Ridge with a front porch and a backyard where I could plant a garden. The decision to buy rather than rent was both practical and symbolic. Practical because it gave me more control over my living space and built equity for my future. Symbolic because it represented my commitment to this new life, my confidence that I had a future worth investing in. Emma helped me move. She brought her boyfriend and some friends from college, young people who were cheerful and energetic and treated me like I was cool rather than elderly. They carried boxes, assembled furniture, and hung pictures while playing music and telling jokes. "This place suits you, Grandma," Emma said as we sat on my new front porch that evening, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset. "It feels like you." She was right. The house felt like me. Not the me I'd been for 47 years of marriage and motherhood, but the me I was becoming. It was comfortable but not indulgent, practical but not austere, welcoming but not overwhelming. It was a home chosen by someone who knew herself and liked what she'd found. George helped me plant the garden that first spring. We chose flowers for beauty and vegetables for practicality, working side by side in the warm soil while talking about our hopes for the growing season. He'd been a widower for 8 years before we met, and he understood the joy of creating something new after loss. "My first wife and I had a garden," he told me as we planted tomato seedlings. "After she died, I thought I'd never want to grow anything again. But this feels different. This feels like beginning instead of ending." The garden flourished that summer, producing more tomatoes and peppers than Emma and I could eat. I shared the surplus with neighbors, starting conversations and building connections throughout my new community. People began stopping by to admire the flowers and ask for gardening advice, and my front porch became an unofficial neighborhood gathering spot. One afternoon, a woman about my age paused while walking her dog and complimented my roses. We started talking, and it turned out she was recently divorced after a 30-year marriage and struggling with loneliness and financial uncertainty. "I don't know how to live alone," she confided. "I've never made decisions by myself, or handled money, or even chosen what to eat for dinner without checking with someone else first." I invited her for tea, and we spent the afternoon talking about independence and self-discovery. By the time she left, she had contact information for the legal aid clinic, a schedule of senior center activities, and most importantly, reassurance that it was possible to build a satisfying life after decades of living for other people. These spontaneous connections happened regularly now. Something about my energy, my willingness to listen without judgment, my obvious contentment with my own company, it drew people who needed encouragement to make changes in their own lives. I realized I'd become the kind of person I'd wished for during my own darkest moments. Someone who would listen to stories of family disappointment without minimizing the pain. Someone who could offer practical resources while honoring the emotional complexity of difficult relationships. Someone who proved that it was possible to start over, even in your 70s. The third anniversary of my court victory fell on a Tuesday in October, exactly 3 years after that terrible Tuesday when I'd watched my own funeral party from my hospital bed. The symmetry wasn't lost on me as I sat on my front porch that evening, reflecting on how completely my life had changed. Instead of lying helpless in a hospital bed, I was strong and healthy, tending plants that I'd chosen and nurturing relationships based on mutual care. Instead of watching my family celebrate my demise, I was surrounded by people who valued my presence in their lives. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was radiating outward. Emma was finishing nursing school with honors and planned to specialize in geriatric care, partly inspired by watching my advocacy work. George had started volunteering at the senior center too, using his plumbing skills to help elderly people with home repairs they couldn't afford. Mrs. Rodriguez had moved to my new neighborhood, not because she needed my help, but because she enjoyed my friendship. She lived 3 blocks away in her own apartment, decorated with photos of her children and grandchildren who visited regularly and treated her with respect. Even my speaking engagements had evolved. What started as presentations about elder financial abuse had grown into workshops about late-life empowerment, healthy boundary setting, and building chosen families when biological families fail us. I was booked months in advance and had started writing a book about my experiences. The book was another development I couldn't have imagined 3 years earlier. A local publisher had approached me after hearing one of my presentations, interested in reaching a broader audience with my message. Writing it had been emotionally challenging, reliving painful memories, organizing decades of experience into coherent themes, but also deeply healing. The process of putting my story into words had helped me understand patterns I'd never recognized, connections between my childhood experiences and my adult relationships, ways that societal expectations had shaped my choices without my conscious awareness. It had given me even more tools to help other people examine their own lives and make empowering changes. As I sat on my porch that anniversary evening, watching the familiar rhythm of my neighborhood settling in for the night, I thought about forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness I'd practiced for decades, the quick, automatic absolution that allowed bad behavior to continue without consequences. Real forgiveness, the kind that acknowledged harm while releasing the grip of resentment. I'd forgiven my children, I realized. Not because they'd apologized, they hadn't. Not because they'd changed. As far as I knew, they were still angry about losing access to my resources. I'd forgiven them because carrying anger was incompatible with the life I wanted to build. Forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean trusting them with my money or my emotional well-being. It didn't mean pretending their actions hadn't hurt me or that I'd accept similar treatment in the future. It simply meant releasing myself from the exhausting work of maintaining anger toward people who weren't part of my daily life anymore. This kind of forgiveness was a gift I gave myself, not them. It freed up emotional space for relationships and activities that brought joy instead of pain. It allowed me to speak about my experiences without bitterness, which made my message more powerful for people who needed to hear it. Emma had asked me recently if I ever regretted standing up to my family, if I missed the relationships we'd had before everything collapsed. The question had surprised me because the answer was so clear. I miss the relationships I thought we had, I'd told her. But those relationships were never real. They were based on my willingness to be exploited and their ability to take advantage of that willingness. What I have now, with you, with George, with my friends, these are real relationships. They're worth so much more than what I lost. The relationships I'd built in my new life were characterized by reciprocity, respect, and genuine affection. George helped me with household repairs, and I helped him organize his finances. Mrs. Rodriguez brought me homemade flan, and I drove her to medical appointments. Emma shared her dreams and concerns with me, and I offered support without trying to control her choices. None of these relationships required me to diminish myself or ignore my own needs. None of them involved financial exploitation or emotional manipulation. All of them enhanced my life and gave me opportunities to enhance others' lives in return. That's what healthy relationships look like, I'd learned. They're characterized by balance, mutual benefit, and respect for individual autonomy. They survive disagreements and conflicts because they're built on genuine care rather than dependency or control. The realization that I'd never experienced healthy family relationships until Emma reached out was initially heartbreaking. All those years of marriage and motherhood, all that sacrifice and devotion, it had been wasted on people who didn't value what I was offering. I'd given my best years to relationships that diminished rather than enhanced my life. But dwelling on the waste would be its own form of waste. What mattered now was that I'd learned to recognize healthy relationships and had the skills to maintain them. What mattered was that other people could learn from my experience and avoid making the same mistakes. The book tour, when it happened, exceeded everyone's expectations. Bookstores, libraries, senior centers, and community groups across the country invited me to speak. The audiences were diverse: elderly people dealing with family exploitation, middle-aged adults caring for difficult aging parents, young people trying to understand intergenerational dynamics. But the message resonated universally. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of age or family role. Everyone has the right to set boundaries and expect respect. Everyone can build meaningful relationships based on mutual care rather than exploitation. The most rewarding part of the tour was meeting people who'd made changes in their lives after reading early versions of my story online. A woman in Phoenix who'd stopped enabling her gambling-addicted adult son. A man in Seattle who'd moved to assisted living on his own terms before his children could force unwanted decisions on him. A couple in Miami who'd restructured their estate planning to reward respectful treatment rather than biological relationship. Each of these people had found the courage to value themselves enough to demand better treatment. They'd discovered, as I had, that the fear of family rejection was often worse than the reality of family rejection. They'd learned that losing exploitative relationships created space for healthier ones. You gave me permission to matter, one woman told me after a presentation in Denver. I spent 70 years thinking my only value was what I could give to other people. You showed me I have value just for being who I am. That's the core of the message I'd learned to live and share. Every human being has inherent worth that doesn't depend on usefulness to others. We matter because we exist, not because of what we can provide. And once we truly believe that, we stop accepting treatment that suggests otherwise. 5 years after that terrible October evening in the hospital, I celebrated my 78th birthday, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, rather than what I could do for them. George had organized a surprise party in my backyard, with Emma handling decorations, and Mrs. Rodriguez coordinating food from neighbors throughout our community. The contrast with previous birthdays was stark. For decades, my birthday had been either ignored entirely or treated as an obligation my children grudgingly acknowledged with perfunctory cards and brief phone calls. This birthday was a genuine celebration of my presence in people's lives, organized by people who wanted to honor me. We ate Mrs. Rodriguez's famous paella, admired the roses George and I had planted, and listened to jazz music while the sun set behind my little house. Emma gave a toast that made everyone cry happy tears. To my grandmother, who taught me that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and that self-respect is the foundation of all other respect. The gifts were thoughtful rather than expensive. A book of poetry from George, who'd learned I enjoyed reading aloud on quiet evenings. A framed photo of our neighborhood garden club from Mrs. Rodriguez, documenting our first successful community garden project. A handmade scarf from Emma, knitted during her breaks between nursing shifts. Each gift reflected genuine knowledge of my interests and genuine care for my happiness. No one gave me anything they expected me to share with others or use for purposes other than my own enjoyment. The gifts were about celebrating me as an individual, not about managing me as a family resource. That night, as I cleaned up after the party with George and Emma's help, I felt a contentment I'd never experienced during my decades of traditional family life. This was what celebrations should feel like, affirming and joyful rather than obligatory and strained. "Are you happy, Grandma?" Emma asked as we washed dishes together in my kitchen. "Happier than I ever thought possible," I told her honestly. And I was. Not because my life was perfect, or because I'd gotten everything I'd ever wanted, but because I was living authentically and surrounding myself with people who valued authenticity. I wasn't pretending to be someone else to maintain relationships that diminished me. I wasn't sacrificing my dignity to avoid conflict. I wasn't accepting crumbs of affection from people who should have been offering me meals. The final chapter of my book dealt with this question of happiness in later life. So many people assume that aging means declining satisfaction, increasing loneliness, diminishing relevance. But my experience had been exactly the opposite. Each year since my awakening had been better than the last, richer in meaningful relationships, more satisfying in daily activities, more aligned with my authentic values and interests. Age had given me perspective that helped me distinguish between what mattered and what didn't. It had given me courage born from realizing I had nothing left to lose by being honest about my needs. It had given me freedom from caring about others' opinions when those opinions were used to control rather than support me. Most importantly, age had given me time to discover who I really was beneath decades of roles and expectations. The woman I'd found was someone I genuinely liked, someone curious and resilient, generous, but not self-sacrificing, capable of both solitude and companionship. This was the message I most wanted to share with other people navigating similar transitions. It's possible to have the best years of your life in your 70s and 80s if you're willing to prioritize your authentic self over others' expectations. It's possible to build new families based on chosen connection rather than biological obligation. It's possible to find meaning and purpose that honor who you are rather than who others want you to be. The speaking engagements eventually led to consulting work with social service agencies, helping them better serve elderly clients who were dealing with family exploitation. I developed training materials for social workers, created resource guides for senior centers, and advocated for policy changes that would better protect vulnerable elderly people. This work felt like the culmination of everything I'd learned, both professionally and personally. My decades of experience as a secretary had given me organizational and communication skills. My years of financial struggle had taught me to research resources and navigate bureaucratic systems. My personal journey from exploitation to empowerment gave me credibility with clients who might otherwise be skeptical of professional advice. But most importantly, my transformation had given me hope to share with people who felt trapped in situations similar to what mine had been. I could honestly tell them that change was possible because I'd lived that change. I could assure them that life could get better because my life had gotten dramatically better. The thing people don't realize, I would tell groups of social workers, is that elderly people who are being exploited by family usually know it's happening. They're not confused or naive. They're making calculated decisions to tolerate abuse because they're afraid the alternative will be complete abandonment. This insight helped social workers approach these situations with more empathy and more effective strategies. Instead of trying to convince clients that their families were mistreating them, which they already knew, workers could focus on helping clients build alternative support systems that would make it safer to set boundaries with exploitative family members. The work was deeply meaningful but also emotionally demanding. Every client reminded me of my former self, trapped in patterns of self-sacrifice that masqueraded as love. Every success story reinforced my belief that transformation was possible, but every failure highlighted how difficult it could be to choose dignity over familiar dysfunction. One client in particular stayed with me. Maria was 81 years old, living with her adult son who had gambling debts and regularly took money from her Social Security checks. She knew what was happening but was terrified of homelessness if she confronted him. "At my age," she said during our first meeting, "who's going to want to rent to me? Who's going to care if I'm okay? At least with my son, I have a roof over my head and someone who checks on me." We worked together for 6 months, slowly building her confidence and her network of alternative supports. I connected her with senior housing programs, helped her open a protected banking account, and introduced her to other elderly people who'd successfully navigated similar situations. The breakthrough came when Maria met George at one of my community presentations. They discovered they'd both grown up in the same neighborhood in Queens, and George began visiting her regularly, offering friendship that didn't depend on financial contribution. "I forgot what it felt like to have someone happy to see me," Maria told me after one of George's visits. "Your friend doesn't want anything from me except my company." I'd forgotten that was possible. With George's support and encouragement, Maria finally confronted her son about the stolen money. The confrontation was ugly. He accused her of being ungrateful, threatened to kick her out, and disappeared for 3 days without explanation. But Maria held firm, and when he returned, she was ready with a new arrangement. He could continue living in her apartment if he contributed fairly to household expenses and stopped taking her money without permission. It took several more months to work out all the details, but Maria eventually established a relationship with her son that was based on mutual respect rather than financial exploitation. He got a steady job, started contributing to household expenses, and even began treating his mother with something resembling affection. "I don't know if he loves me," Maria said toward the end of our formal working relationship, "but at least he respects me now. And I respect myself, which is something I hadn't felt in years." Maria's success story was one of hundreds I witnessed during my consulting years. Each person's situation was unique, but the underlying dynamics were remarkably similar. Elderly people who'd spent decades prioritizing others' needs over their own, adult children who'd learned to exploit that generosity, and families trapped in patterns of mutual resentment disguised as obligation. The solutions were also remarkably similar. Helping elderly people build alternative support systems, teaching them to recognize and communicate their inherent worth, and providing practical resources for establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries. But the most crucial element was always hope. People who'd been trapped in exploitative relationships for decades needed living proof that change was possible. They needed to see someone like me, someone who'd been where they were and had found a way out. That's why I continued sharing my story long after the book was published and the speaking tour ended. My personal narrative had become a tool for helping other people write new chapters in their own stories. My transformation had become a catalyst for other people's transformations. As I approached my 80th birthday, I reflected on the unexpected trajectory my life had taken. If someone had told me at 73, lying in that hospital bed watching my premature funeral, that I'd spend my remaining years traveling the country, writing books, and helping thousands of people improve their lives, I'd have thought they were delusional. But that's exactly what had happened. The worst betrayal of my life had become the catalyst for the best years of my life. The family relationships that had diminished me had been replaced by chosen relationships that enhanced me. The exploitation that had made me feel worthless had given me experiences that made my later work invaluable. None of this is to say that the betrayal was worth it or that I'd choose to repeat the experience. The pain was real, the losses were significant, and the years of exploitation can never be recovered. But once the betrayal happened, I'd had a choice. I could remain a victim forever, or I could use the experience to become someone who helped other victims find their own paths to liberation. I chose liberation, both for myself and as a gift to others who were still trapped where I had been. The speaking engagements had largely ended by my 80th birthday, but the friendships I'd made during those years continued to enrich my life. I received letters, emails, and phone calls from people across the country who'd heard me speak and continued to apply the lessons in their own evolving situations. Some had reconciled with family members on healthier terms. Others had ended exploitative relationships and built new chosen families. Nearly all had discovered reserves of strength and self-worth they'd forgotten they possessed. Their continued growth and happiness were the greatest validations of the path I'd chosen. Emma had graduated from nursing school and was working in geriatrics at the same hospital where I'd been treated for my stroke. She often told me about elderly patients who reminded her of me, people who'd spent so many years caring for others that they'd forgotten to care for themselves. "I use your story all the time," she told me during one of our regular Sunday dinners at my house. "Not the specific details, but the basic message that it's never too late to start treating yourself with the respect you deserve. It helps people realize they have more power than they think they do." George and I had been together for 6 years by then, long enough to have weathered several health scares and major life transitions. We'd never married. Neither of us felt the need for legal formalization of a relationship that was already solid and satisfying. But we'd become genuine life partners. He'd had a minor heart attack the previous year, which reminded us both that our time together was precious and finite. But instead of making us fearful or desperate, the reminder made us more intentional about enjoying each day we had. "I wasted too many years of my marriage worrying about the future," I told George during his recovery. "I'm not going to waste any of our time together that way." We focused on simple pleasures: morning coffee on the front porch, afternoon walks through the neighborhood, evening conversations about books we'd read or places we hoped to visit. We traveled when his health permitted, short trips to places we'd always heard about but never seen. The travel was different from the California trip I'd taken alone after my court victory. That trip had been about proving to myself that I could navigate the world independently. These trips with George were about sharing discoveries with someone who enhanced the experience rather than limiting it. Mrs. Rodriguez had become the unofficial grandmother of our entire block, despite having plenty of biological grandchildren who adored her. Her apartment was the gathering place for neighborhood children who needed after-school snacks, elderly neighbors who wanted company, and anyone else who could benefit from her warmth and wisdom. "You taught me something important," she told me one afternoon as we sat in her garden sharing café con leche and gossip about our neighbors. "You taught me that love is supposed to make you bigger, not smaller. All these years, I thought that was just how family worked. Everyone else comes first, and you get whatever's left over. But watching you change your life, I realized I could change mine too. Mrs. Rodriguez had started setting boundaries with her own adult children, who'd been taking advantage of her generosity in ways that were less dramatic than what I'd experienced, but no less draining. She'd stopped providing free babysitting whenever it was convenient for them, and started charging her grandson for the car repairs she'd been doing for free. The changes had initially caused conflict, but ultimately her relationships with her family had improved because they were now based on respect rather than assumption. These ripple effects of my transformation were among its most gratifying aspects. By learning to value myself, I'd given others permission to value themselves. By establishing healthy boundaries, I'd shown others that boundaries were possible. By building a fulfilling life after family rejection, I demonstrated that biological relationships weren't the only source of love and connection. The book had won several awards and been translated into multiple languages, reaching audiences I'd never expected to influence. I received letters from readers in other countries who were dealing with similar family dynamics within different cultural contexts. A woman in Japan wrote about caring for elderly parents who demanded constant attention while treating her with contempt. A man in Germany described adult children who visited only when they needed money. A grandmother in Australia shared her story of being excluded from family events unless she could provide childcare or financial support. The specifics varied across cultures, but the underlying patterns were universal. Elderly people being valued for what they could provide rather than who they were, and families that maintained connection through exploitation rather than genuine affection. The international response reinforced my belief that the message had broad relevance. Elder exploitation wasn't unique to American families or to any particular socioeconomic class. It happened wherever people learned to equate love with self-sacrifice, and wherever families confused obligation with genuine care. On my 80th birthday, Emma organized another backyard celebration, this one larger than the previous ones because my network of friends had expanded significantly. People came from the senior center, from my former consulting clients, from neighborhood organizations, and from the various communities I'd become part of over the past 7 years. George had created a memory board with photos from my various speaking events, travel adventures, and community projects. Looking at those images, I was struck by how confident and joyful I appeared in them, such a contrast to the tense, apologetic expression I'd worn in family photos from my earlier life. "You look like someone who likes herself," Emma observed, studying the photos with me. "That's not how you looked in the old pictures Mom used to show us when we were kids." She was right. The woman in my recent photos looked comfortable in her own skin, pleased with her life, proud of her accomplishments. She looked like someone worth celebrating, someone whose 80th birthday deserved genuine attention and appreciation. The party lasted well into the evening, with neighbors dropping by throughout the day to share cake and conversation. Children from the block played in my backyard while their parents chatted with my contemporaries about gardening, local politics, and shared community concerns. It was the kind of intergenerational gathering I'd always imagined family life should involve. Different ages mixing naturally, everyone contributing something valuable to the collective experience. Connections based on mutual enjoyment rather than obligation or exploitation. "This is what family should look like," George murmured as we watched the cheerful chaos from our chairs on the porch. "People who choose to be together because they make each other's lives better." That evening, after the last guests had gone home and Emma had helped us clean up, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 8 years earlier, I'd been a woman so desperate for family connection that I'd accepted financial exploitation and emotional abuse rather than risk abandonment. I'd been invisible to myself, existing only in relation to other people's needs, with no independent identity or autonomous desires. Now I was a woman with a house full of chosen family, a calendar full of meaningful activities, and a legacy of helping other people discover their own worth and power. I was someone whose opinions were sought, whose presence was valued, whose contributions were appreciated and reciprocated. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. It had required confronting painful truths about relationships I'd wanted to believe were loving. It had meant accepting the loss of connections I'd hoped to repair. It had demanded learning new skills, developing new perspectives, and building new communities. But every difficult step had been worth taking. Every painful revelation had cleared space for healthier relationships. Every loss had created opportunities for better gains. As I sat in my garden that night, surrounded by the flowers George and I had planted and nurtured together, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with external validation. I was proud of the person I'd become, pleased with the life I'd built, grateful for the relationships that sustained and inspired me. This was what contentment felt like, not the absence of challenges or sorrows, but the presence of meaning, purpose, and genuine connection. It was the satisfaction of knowing that my life mattered, that my presence in the world had positive impact, that the people who loved me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The letters and messages I continued to receive from people who'd been inspired by my story were evidence that the impact extended far beyond my immediate circle. My experience had become a catalyst for other people's growth, a proof of concept that late-life transformation was possible, a source of hope for people who felt trapped in diminishing situations. "You saved my life" was a phrase I heard regularly from people who'd attended my presentations or read my book. They meant it literally in some cases. Several people had told me that my story had prevented them from considering suicide during their darkest moments of family crisis. But more often, they meant I'd saved the quality of their lives by showing them alternatives to resignation and acceptance of mistreatment. I'd given them permission to want more from their relationships and their daily experiences. I'd provided a roadmap for getting from exploitation to empowerment. This impact had become my most treasured legacy. Financial assets could be stolen or depleted, but the positive changes I'd inspired in other people's lives would continue rippling outward long after I was gone. The courage I'd found and shared would help others find courage. The respect I'd learned to demand would teach others to demand respect. Emma often asked me about end-of-life planning, approaching the topic with professional knowledge but personal concern. "Have you thought about what you want to happen when you can't take care of yourself anymore?" she'd ask during our Sunday dinners. The question didn't frighten me the way it might have years earlier. I had legal documents that protected my autonomy, financial resources that ensured good care, and people who would advocate for my wishes even if I couldn't communicate them myself. More importantly, I had a life full of relationships and experiences that made aging less frightening. I wasn't desperately clinging to an existence filled with exploitation and disappointment. I was peacefully progressing through a life characterized by dignity, purpose, and love. "When my time comes," I told Emma, "I want you to know that I lived exactly the life I chose. Every day since I left that hospital has been a gift I gave myself by refusing to accept less than I deserved. If I died tomorrow, I'd die completely satisfied with how I spent these last years." That satisfaction wasn't dependent on my former family acknowledging their mistakes or apologizing for the harm they'd caused. It wasn't based on external validation or public recognition of my accomplishments. It came from the internal knowledge that I'd used my remaining years wisely, authentically, and generously. The wisdom I'd gained through suffering had been transformed into wisdom that helped others avoid or escape similar suffering. The strength I'd developed through necessity had become strength that I could share with people who needed encouragement. The love I'd learned to give myself had overflowed into love I could offer to others without depleting myself. This was the real victory of my transformation. Not just that I'd escaped an abusive situation, but that I'd turned the experience into something that served a larger purpose. My pain had meaning because it had given me tools to help other people heal their pain. As I finish telling you this story, I want to leave you with the most important lesson I've learned. It's never too late to start treating yourself with the respect you deserve. Age doesn't disqualify you from setting boundaries, demanding dignity, or building new relationships based on mutual care. The people who truly love you will support your growth and respect your boundaries. The people who don't support your growth and respect your boundaries don't truly love you, regardless of their biological relationship to you or their claims of affection. You have the right to surround yourself with people who enhance your life rather than diminish it. You have the right to spend your time on activities that bring you joy rather than drain your energy. You have the right to use your resources for your own well-being rather than other people's convenience. Most importantly, you have the right to matter. Not because of what you can do for others, but because of who you are as a unique and valuable human being. If my story sounds familiar to you, if you recognize yourself in the woman I used to be, or the family dynamics I've described, please know that change is possible. Help is available. You don't have to accept mistreatment because you're afraid of being alone. You don't have to buy love by accepting abuse. You don't have to disappear in order to keep peace. The life you could build for yourself might be smaller than the life you're currently living, but it will be authentically yours. It might include fewer people, but they will be people who see and value the real you. It might require difficult conversations and painful choices, but it will lead to days filled with dignity instead of desperation. Have you lived something similar to what I've shared with you? Do you know someone who has walked this path or is walking it now? I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below. If this story has touched you, if it's given you hope or courage or simply helped you feel less alone, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sharing these stories is how we help each other heal and grow. Together, we can create a world where everyone, regardless of age or family circumstances, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Your life matters. Your happiness matters. You matter. Don't forget that, and don't let anyone else make you forget it either. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing me as the person I've become rather than the person I used to be. And thank you for considering whether there might be someone in your life who needs to hear these words as much as I once needed to hear them.